All right, so good evening. Thanks to those of you who are watching and for the person attending, I appreciate you taking the time. Welcome to week 8 of our workshop on global conflict and cooperation. As a reminder, this workshop is focused on defining, exploring, and discussing global conflict and cooperation from the point of view of different international institutions, country governments, and international non-governmental organizations. Now, we started this workshop back in the summer, so if you're interested in watching the recordings from the summer, you are obviously encouraged to do so. The first 4 are conceptual or theoretical, so it kind of sets up what these broader concepts are and then starts getting into examples of it. And what I've done for the fall semester is focus on specific examples, starting with countries for the first 4 weeks and now looking at regions of the world these past 4 weeks. So today we'll talk about the Atlantic, part 2. So we'll go ahead and jump to that. Now, our learning objectives for this workshop are the following. First is to define the Atlantic region. Secondly is to describe an example of conflict in the region. And then lastly is to describe an example of cooperation in the region. Now, recall from last week and this week, the Atlantic region covers both the North Atlantic and the South Atlantic oceans. And you'll see here on the western edges of the North and South Atlantic, you have the United States, the Caribbean countries, and then South America, largely with Brazil as the cornerstone of that part of the world. On the eastern part of the Atlantic Oceans, you'll have Europe, and then West Africa, and then the southern part of the African continent. So this is a pretty vast region, covers many millions of square miles, and it just makes it the connection between these 4 continents, really, the United States and Europe, and Africa and South America, and then vice versa. A very complex, very diverse, very dynamic region. So with that said, let's go look at 2 examples of conflict. I want to bring in a non-military example, because most of the times when we think of conflict, we're always thinking of the military war and arms and things like that. But I want to focus on one that's not military. So the first one we'll look at is the transatlantic relationship descends into a food fight. And let's go ahead and open up that article. And I'll have this read to us, or we'll play to listen about 2 or 4 minutes of it. Okay.
The transatlantic relationship descends into a food fight. America and Europe have competing visions of how to feed the world, and we could all be caught in the crossfire. Brace yourself for the next superpower showdown across the Atlantic. This time the ideological clash is all about how we grow our food. In the race to reduce the damage that agriculture is wreaking on the climate, the EU and the US are veering toward a high-stakes standoff over how to transform the global food system, and their dueling visions could mean we all lose out. The brewing Cold War between the 2 agricultural heavyweights over the future of farming risks undermining not only tens of billions of euros worth of agricultural trade annually, but also threatens to undercut the more fundamental aspiration to reverse global warming through cooperation on food systems, which are responsible for more than a third of greenhouse gas emissions. It's pretty clear there are 2 different pathways, and I think the United States and many other countries are going to go down one path, and the EU is going to go down a different path. U.S. Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack told Politico in an interview in which he barely veiled his criticism of the EU's farming philosophy. America's chief bogeyman is Europe's farm-to-fork strategy, which seeks to prioritize sustainability by slashing pesticide usage in half by 2030 and by ensuring that organic production covers a quarter of European farmland. For Washington, this is a recipe for disaster that will reduce crop yields, push up food prices and threaten food security. The U.S. Department of Agriculture has released economic models saying world food production would drop by 11% and prices would shoot up 89% if all countries followed the European model. The world's got to get fed, and it's got to get fed in a sustainable way. And we can't basically sacrifice one for the other, Vilsack said. Coalition of the Tilling. In what Vilsack has described as America's response to farm-to-fork, the U.S. unveiled a new international coalition for increasing food production in a sustainable way as part of the UN's Food Systems Summit in September. It's a grouping through which he is looking to marshal together countries, probably across the Americas initially, to ensure that the EU won't dictate the new norms across the world's cornfields and dairy farms. There are a number of nations who believe strongly that we can't sacrifice productivity in order to reach a sustainability goal, Vilsack said. These days, trade is all about the battle for international standards, and the US has long smarted over how the EU has flexed its muscle through trade policy to impose global food norms, including the geographical indication labels that protect its premium brands like Champagne and Parma ham. Washington doesn't.
And so if we go on and read the rest of the article, it kind of describes this ongoing conflict between the United States and Europe when it comes to agricultural and food policy. And one thing that's really fascinating about this process is how it's elevated in the context of climate change. And so when we think of conflict, right, we always think that there's two countries kind of battling it out. But in this case, it's the United States, which is a massive agricultural producer. And across the North Atlantic, we have the European Union, which has been consistently developing these pretty specific and well-developed agricultural policies to the chagrin of the United States, and in this case, the Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack. Now, what's really fascinating is that they're not just fighting it out, right, in some kind of forum like the United Nations or the World Bank or some kind of international institution, but they're battling it out amongst each other, and then they realize that in order to address the conflict that they have, that they need to have other cooperative mechanisms to facilitate this conversation and to see, it's like a will of countries when it comes to developing the agricultural and food policy of the world. And so when I was listening to this, it was interesting that the UN hosted this food system summit, and that it seems like the United States is beginning this process of building relationships, or strengthening the relationships, or reconnecting with old relationships around the world to say, hey, this is how we're going to approach it. All in all, it's just a really fascinating connection between climate change, food policy, and geopolitics that we're observing here. Now, the second example I'd like us to look to is obviously a conflict example, and this one's titled "The European Union Army: Afghanistan Revives Debate Over a European Military." So I'll go ahead and check out this article, and I'll have this read to us as well for the first few sentences here, or first few paragraphs.
Brussels. The chaotic withdrawal and evacuation from Afghanistan, which has already prompted soul-searching among Western partners, is now reviving a decades-old debate within the European Union. Does the 27-nation club need its own military? The EU is in its most idealistic sense a peace project. Economic interdependence was supposed to ward off conflicts between members, and it has created the world's largest trading bloc. While acknowledging that clout, some of its most prominent politicians have argued for years that to become a true global power, the EU needs its own defense force, one that is independent of the US-European NATO alliance, and does not rely on the United States. America First Light: Afghanistan withdrawal brings a Biden doctrine into focus. The subject is controversial, and the geopolitics are fraught. Many experts say the prospect of rolling out a freestanding EU military anytime soon is unrealistic. But the clamoring, which subsided somewhat after President Biden's election, has intensified once more, after Biden rebuffed calls to keep US troops in Afghanistan past the August 31st deadline. European leaders say that left them no choice but to cut short their evacuations, leaving thousands of their citizens and Afghan allies behind. EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell asserted that a proposed joint rapid deployment force of 5,000 troops could have helped to secure the Kabul airport, and that a coordinated European security strategy would have allowed the bloc more influence over the timing and nature of the withdrawal. The only way forward is to combine our forces and strengthen not only our capacity, but also our will to act, Borrell said after a meeting of EU defense ministers in Slovenia on Thursday. Other leaders have argued for strategic autonomy, an ill-defined EU buzz phrase that refers to the need for the bloc to become more self-sufficient on a range of issues, especially security. French President Emmanuel Macron is one of the concept's biggest boosters, and has been calling for a true European army since he took office, while at one point criticizing NATO as brain dead. Some nations, especially the Baltic states, remain wary of duplicating NATO's efforts, and would be unlikely to support a new joint force. German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who once endorsed Macron's suggestion for an army, has nonetheless been a staunch supporter of NATO, as well as the US military bases in her country. But Armin Laschet, who is vying to succeed her, said recently that Europe must be strengthened such that we never have to leave it up to Americans. On Thursday, German Defense Minister Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer argued for another approach. The EU should have a coordinated security strategy that puts it on equal footing with the United States, she said, but that shouldn't require an extra EU force. The military capabilities in the EU countries are available, she wrote on Twitter, suggesting that a coalition of the willing could mobilize after a bloc-wide vote.
So this article goes on to describe the tension within the European Union and its member countries about establishing a more permanent military or a standalone military. What I found fascinating about this conversation, obviously it's in the context of the United States making a very significant military geopolitical decision by withdrawing from Afghanistan after 20 years of conflict, and basically the European Union member countries not knowing. At the same time, you've seen the European Union grow in its sophistication over the years, as we'll learn about in the next slide, as first a coal and iron bloc, right? A set of countries saying they're going to work together. This was after World War II, right? They had this huge conflict amongst each other. Twice with World War I and World War II. And they said, we need to come together. And the way to do that is by bringing together our economies. So they've been doing that now for the past 50 plus years and been very successful at it. And at the same time, you have this emergence of this institution like the European Union, which is basically like a federal government, if you wanted to make some kind of crude comparison between the United States and that region. So now that the United States made this decision, some people are arguing that this was just rhetoric from countries who felt like they didn't have a choice because the Americans made a choice for them. Well, obviously, because the United States has invested the most amount of time, money, people, and treasure in Afghanistan and the Middle East more broadly. And I don't think the United States felt like it needed to say, EU, this is what we're doing, or member countries, this is what we're doing. They're just that we're going to go do it and get it done, given prior commitments and the direction that the new president was taking that conflict. And so when you think about the idea of the European Union having its standalone army that would, I'm assuming, be in parallel to NATO, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and we learned about that last week, you're kind of, in my mind, I'm like, why would the continent of Europe want to have its own military? Because once you have that mechanism, you'll use it if you need to, and it'll be divorced from what the United States' interests are. So I think if you're looking at this just from the United States' perspective, you can kind of tell yourself, well, it's probably not in our best interest that the European Union go off and have their own military, because if they go do something like with Russia or one of the Central Asian countries, then we're going to get dragged into it anyway. So if we're going to get dragged into it, how about we have NATO there as the buffer and the mechanism by which our militaries are coordinated and jointly working towards some kind of resolution in order to avoid future conflict. So we'll see where this goes. My sense is that there's probably not a lot of eagerness to have these member country governments spend any more money on their military than they currently do. And obviously their future has always been fostered in this space of cooperation. Now it's just a matter of them extending that cooperation to other parts of Central and Western Asia and North Africa. So we'll see how that goes. Yeah, feel free to ask your question, Reagan.
Well, somewhere it's like a comment, but with this idea that Europe wants to sort of make their own military system separate from, the US, it puts in perspective almost like, does it come at risk of our allied countries at that point? Like, is this incorporating France or Italy or most of Europe? And at that point, are they risking our relationship towards them? Like, what if we get drawn into another war?
Right. So I think that's a really, really helpful question, right? Because the European Union as a body has slowly what we call federalized or centralized some of its authority making. And this is why member countries some of them have pointed to saying, like, we don't want to be like the United States. Like, we're a coalition of independent sovereign countries. Yeah. And the EU, we feel, is taking too much of our power. And there's been these dynamics in that on the continent for some time now. Now, that would in my mind, that would have to be negotiated, because the mechanism that brings the United States in militarily into Europe is NATO. And as was pointed out a few workshops ago, or at least in some discussion I had, the first time NATO invoked a particular article of mutual defense was after 9/11, like saying, now one of our friends, one of our member countries in NATO got attacked, and now we're going to turn on NATO, and then NATO is going to be a mechanism by which to go after the folks who attacked the United States.
Right.
And that was the first time they did it. So we'll see. I mean, I'm optimistic that cooler heads will prevail on the continent,
Mhm.
and at the same time, I think the United States will weigh in when it has to, and
Right.
probably not publicly. We won't see these conversations, but they'll basically say, "What are you guys trying to do here? Like, how about you just focus on what you're good at and leave the military to us? You know, when we're needed, we'll show up. But
Right.
if you guys have it."
I'm really drawn to the one quote from the German council or her successor is, so we don't have to rely on the American or the US Army or something about Americans. I think that is so precedented of how Europeans or foreign countries view us and how we go to conflict or how we go into war. It's at this point now they're seeing it as, well, they went into Afghanistan for such a long time, they were here for such a long time, and now they're drawing out because it's you know, it's almost like they're taking notes. They're definitely taking notes about how we're reacting and how we're treating our Navy. And it's like maybe we're putting off this idea that we're not reliable anymore, but possibly the successor is quite an extremist viewpoint. But I
Yeah,
thought it was very interesting.
yeah, I don't know if that there was the election in Germany. I don't remember who won, but I
Right.
don't think it was her. I think it was a gentleman. So
Yeah,
in any
Army,
case, yeah,
this
I
guy's quote, it's just so
maybe.
relevant to kind of how Europeans view the American military.
Yeah, I think they just, it's, if I had to speculate, my sense is that any country that's sovereign wishes to have the military capacity to exercise self-defense and or provocation when and where they want to, given
Right.
their national interests, which are largely based on political or economic forces. So in this case, I think this is them reacting to a very significant geopolitical decision that the United States
Right.
is taking, but I don't think it's enough for them to warrant it. And if anything, the counter argument is pretty straightforward. If we build up an independent military,
Right.
then who's going to be threatened by it? Russia. I mean, so
One of the biggest nations, exactly.
yeah, so why would we do that? Let me go ahead and jump to the next slide here about cooperation. And this is highlighting the EU. So we'll go ahead and talk a little bit more about this cooperative organization. And let me go ahead and pull up this part of the site. So the EU has goals like they want to promote peace and freedom and sustainable development and combat, social exclusion and discrimination. These are their stated values as a bloc. So human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, rule of law, and human rights. They've managed to have a very significant periods of peace over time. And they'll just point out here that before the EU was created, there is times of peace and there's times of war. And ever since the EU has been created, it's been peaceful on the continent of Europe. And so they went from economic to a political union. They were largely focused, like I mentioned before, on coal and iron and basically working together to expand their rail and other industries. And then from there, what really changed them was having what's called a single market. So instead of having essentially borders across these countries when it came to people and goods, that they were going to eliminate those so that there'd be the free movement of goods and people on the European continent. And this is obviously very significant because it demonstrates that independent sovereign countries can work through their differences and kind of find these commonalities. One thing that really rocked the Union over the past year and a half or so was the exit of the United Kingdom. So on the 31st of January, the United Kingdom left the European Union, and that decision really shook UK politics. And it's still reverberating today. So like, for example, you might read in the news that there was fuel shortages and truck driver shortages in England. And their prime minister, Boris Johnson, was like, in the past, the solution was to import workers, low wage workers to do the work. And he's like, we're not going to do that anymore. So it's just interesting to see, this test case about how a country deals with, and the European Union deals with an exit of a member, in this case, a very significant member of financial and other trade. So with that, they moved to a single currency, which made a very significant difference. It wasn't now just moving people and goods and having to trade in, your francs for your pound or whatever currencies. Like they all have a euro that they work with. And that really facilitated the transactions and the engagements between these countries. So what's really interesting here is just how the EU shapes the region and how it's kind of coming into its own. It's the way I've always viewed it is that it's an organic form of federal government or federalism. So like here in the United States, obviously we had we had 13 colonies which viewed themselves as sovereign. And then we did the Articles of Confederation for a little bit. That failed because they didn't see there was a central authority. So then we created a federal government right away. And we've always had that tension in this country, between federal and state power. So here in the EU, it's like almost the reverse, right? There's always been state power, and then they've slowly ceded to this federal or this central authority, and that's created tension within the bloc. But overall, we'll see how this shapes up. And this is just a very clear example of cooperation, right? Because it's 27 member states that had to work over decades, almost a century's worth of time to reach this point of cooperation. So I like to just point that out because there's a lot of scholars of the EU, a lot of research is done on the EU, and then this notion of a European identity has developed over these past 20 plus years. So with all that, I'll end with implications and we can get to a little bit more discussion. This US-EU trade summit in Pittsburgh with the goal of kind of strengthening the ties. So I'm going to open up that article and we'll let these first few paragraphs play here. Let me try this, listen to the article.
US-EU Trade Summit in Pittsburgh aims to deepen economic ties. Trade and Technology Summit is intended to expand a vast and deep partnership that is lately under stress. By Daniel Michaels. September 26, 2021, 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Senior U.S. and European officials meet in Pittsburgh on Wednesday, aiming to show that closer transatlantic ties have value in dollars and euros. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo, and U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai plan to sit down with European Commission Executive Vice Presidents Margrethe Vestager and Valdis Dombrovskis to launch a forum they agreed to in June, the U.S.-EU Trade and Technology Council. Underpinning the talks is a fact often lost in debates both sides have about voluminous trade with China. The U.S. and European Union are by far each other's most important economic partner, by orders of magnitude. Businesses on both sides are eager to expand the partnership. The meeting comes at a tense time for transatlantic relations, following the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan that many Europeans feel the U.S. mishandled, and European anger over the U.S. sale of submarines to Australia. That deal usurped a French contract valued at roughly $65 billion, inspiring fury in Paris and beyond. In Washington, meanwhile, many people believe Europe doesn't spend enough on consumption or defense, leading to economic imbalances. The Pittsburgh meeting aims to look beyond those differences and start tackling new and long-festering obstacles to commerce between the giant economies. It isn't a deal negotiation, and concrete results won't emerge quickly. The goal is to align priorities and create a joint agenda. 10 working groups will tackle items including differences over data governance, technical standards, and export controls to third countries. Some items like investment screening, cooperation, and securing supply chains are more about cooperating against China, Russia, and other adversarial economies. But even those priorities entail deeper US-EU commercial linkages, since each considers the other among its most familiar and secure foreign markets. Agenda item: climate and clean.
And so this article goes on to describe what the aims of the summit in Pittsburgh were. And just at least two things I took away from this were, first, that the relationship between the US and the EU, or the European continent, is pretty strong when it comes to trade. Part of the challenge is that obviously we're buying more of their products than they're buying of our products. And it's also put into the context of how the US is basically reshuffling its geopolitical dynamics. If you watch the recordings from about the Pacific, right, demonstrating like how the United States is at least militarily and also economically shifting its focus to the Pacific region. But that's in context of having a very long and deep history with the Atlantic region. And so in my mind, I kind of see it two ways. It's like the US is trying to pool these two regions together, serving as the bridge, understanding the realities of the situation in the Pacific with the rising China and the history of the Atlantic. And at the same time, knowing that because of shared interests politically, strengthening and keeping those ties with the European Union is really important. So people are starting to see just how much market economies and non-market economies, how their political systems interact with each other and the significance of them when it comes to balancing out kind of what people might see. I don't say as threats, I think it's too strong of a word, but emerging concerns. So overall, this just gives an example where the idea of thinking about countries and blocks of countries and the relationships both historically and contemporarily really are shaped by a multitude of things. And what's really fascinating, I think, for students of politics and of international relations particularly, is that this is going to be the forefront, right, of policy making, foreign policy making in the United States, and then the forefront of international law, international norms going forward. So it's an exciting time, I think, on the world scale to think about what's going on and the opportunities that present itself, both, I think, to be involved, to be engaged, but also to just, if you know, you're like, if you're like, I'm not going to be an international business person, I'm not going to be a international political consultant or some kind of foreign service officer, just being aware of it enough, knowing that that's will come into American politics and shape campaigns and elections and how people are voting. It's all really fascinating. So with that, I'll go ahead and move us to our discussion, and I'll stop the recording. Thanks again for those of you taking the time to watch. Take care.